When Jack Thornton plunged into the raging floodwaters to rescue a boy trapped in a sinking car, he never imagined he was saving the only son of America's most reclusive tech billionaire. With his crops ravaged by an unprecedented drought and bankruptcy looming over his family's century-old farm, Jack returned from the hospital 1 week later to find a motorcade of black SUVs kicking up dust on his driveway. Standing on his weathered porch, he watched as Theodore Blackwood, the legendary founder of Nexus Technologies, stepped out with a proposition that would alter the course of generations. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Jack Thornton's calloused hands moved with practiced efficiency across the irrigation controls he jury-rigged from spare parts and sheer determination. At 47, his face bore the permanent tan and weathered lines of someone who'd spent his life under the open sky of western Colorado. His sturdy frame hadn't been shaped by any gym membership, but by decades of lifting, hauling, and the constant battle against the elements that defined a farmer's existence. The merciless August sun beat down on the parched fields of Thornton Family Farms, the land stretching out before him like a patient on life support. The drought, now in its second year, had transformed what should have been vibrant fields of corn and wheat into a desperate landscape of struggling plants and cracked earth. Jack adjusted the flow rate on his makeshift drip system, trying to distribute the precious little water from his dwindling well reserves to the areas most likely to survive. "Just hang in there a little longer," he murmured to a row of corn that had somehow maintained its green despite the brutal conditions. His voice was rough from disuse. Days could pass on the farm with no one to talk to except his aging border collie, Rusty, who now perked up his ears from where he lay in the narrow strip of shade cast by Jack's truck. From the nearby hill, Rusty suddenly sprang to attention, barking twice before racing toward the gravel driveway that connected the farm to the county road. Jack straightened, wincing as his back protested years of hard labor. Squinting against the sun, he made out the familiar dust cloud that announced his sister's arrival before her blue sedan came into view. "Should have known I'd find you out here cooking yourself," called Susan Thornton as she stepped from her car, waving a hand in front of her face to disperse the dust. At 43, Susan carried the Thornton features: strong jaw, deep-set eyes, the color of steel. But her hands were smooth, her shoulders unburdened by the weight of the struggling family legacy. She'd escaped the gravitational pull of the farm 20 years ago for a teaching position in Riverdale, the nearest town of any size 30 miles away. "Heat doesn't bother me much anymore," Jack replied with a half-smile, though they both knew it was a lie. No one got used to Colorado summers that had grown increasingly brutal over the years. "Coffee's still hot if you want some." They walked together toward the two-story farmhouse that had sheltered 4 generations of Thorntons. Its white paint was peeling, the wraparound porch sagged slightly on the western corner, but to Jack, it remained the heart of everything that mattered. Inside, the kitchen was modest but immaculate, with the original hardwood floors his grandfather had installed, and the sturdy oak table around which family decisions had been made for nearly a century. Susan settled at the table while Jack poured 2 mugs of coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in, the way their father had always made it. Along the kitchen walls hung the visual history of Thornton Family Farms, Jack and Susan as children helping with the harvest. Their mother standing proudly beside her prize-winning sunflowers, their grandparents posed with the first tractor the family ever owned. Most prominently displayed was a faded photograph of their great-grandfather William Thornton standing in front of the newly built farmhouse in 1924. "How's David?" Jack asked, referring to Susan's husband as he set the steaming mugs down. "Busy. The community college just approved his proposal for an environmental science program, so he's been working non-stop on the curriculum. Susan wrapped her hands around the warm mug. "The kids were asking about you. Thought maybe you'd come for Sunday dinner this week. I'm making that blackberry cobbler you like." Jack nodded, though they both knew he rarely left the farm these days. There was always too much to do, too many systems on the verge of failure, too few hands to help. After his wife Rebecca had left 8 years ago, unable to weather the financial uncertainty and isolation of farm life, Jack had retreated. Further into his work, finding solace in the rhythm of seasons and the predictability of sunrise and sunset, if not market prices or rainfall. "You didn't drive all this way to invite me to dinner," Jack said, noticing the familiar look of concern in his sister's eyes. Susan sighed, tracing the rim of her mug with one finger. Alan Peterson from Western Colorado Bank was in the teacher's lounge yesterday, talking to David. Jack's jaw tightened. He'd hoped to have more time before word spread. Riverdale was small, just under 5,000 people, and news traveled quickly, especially bad news about one of the county's oldest farming families. "My business with the bank is private," Jack said more sharply than he'd intended. "Not in Riverdale it isn't," Susan countered. "Jack, if you're in trouble again, I'm handling it." Jack stood and moved to the window overlooking his fields. The drought-resistant corn variety he'd invested nearly everything in after last year's crop failure. The truth he couldn't bring himself to share was that Thornton Family Farms was 3 months behind on its loan payments. The bank had granted extensions based on the projected yield of his summer crops, but their patience was wearing thin. If he couldn't deliver a harvest substantial enough to make a significant payment by September 30th, Western Colorado Bank would begin foreclosure proceedings. "You know," Susan said carefully, "the offer still stands. David and I have that money from his parents. We could—" "No," Jack cut her off firmly. "I've told you before, I'm not taking your savings. This farm has been in our family for 4 generations. It's my responsibility now." Susan ran a hand through her hair in frustration, a gesture so like their father that Jack had to look away. "It's not just your responsibility, Jack. It's your life, all of it. When's the last time you even left the county? Took a day off? The farm was never meant to be a prison." Jack remained silent. How could he explain to Susan that the farm wasn't a prison, but his purpose? That despite the hardships, the droughts, the equipment breakdowns, the rising costs and falling crop prices, he still felt the same connection to this land that had sustained their family through the Great Depression, 2 world wars, and countless personal tragedies? Thorntons don't quit. That's what their grandmother had said countless times during Jack's childhood. Her words had carried him through Rebecca's departure, through the crop failures, through the lonely nights when the enormity of preserving the family legacy threatened to crush him. "The corn looks better than expected," Jack said finally, changing the subject. "Drought-resistant hybrid is proving its worth. If the weather holds and I can keep the irrigation system running, I should have enough to make a payment to the bank and have seed money for next spring." Susan looked skeptical but didn't press further. She knew her brother well enough to recognize when a subject was closed. Instead, she reached into her bag and withdrew a small wrapped package. "Early birthday present," she said, pushing it across the table. "David found it at that antique shop in Grand Junction." Jack unwrapped it carefully to find a restored vintage compass, the brass case engraved with the initials W.T., William Thornton, their great-grandfather. "David had it restored by an expert," Susan explained. "The shop owner said it likely helped guide William when he first came west to stake his claim." Jack ran his finger along the engraving, emotion tightening his throat. In the compass, he saw his great-grandfather's determination, the same pioneering spirit he tried to maintain despite increasingly impossible odds. "Thank him for me," Jack managed, setting the compass carefully on the table. They talked for another hour about Susan's students, about the county's declining population as more young people left for cities, about the weather forecast that predicted potential thunderstorms in the coming week. What remained unspoken was their shared fear that Jack might be the last Thornton to farm this land, that a legacy nearly a century in the making might end on his watch. The next morning dawned hot and unusually humid, the kind of oppressive air that made Colorado farmers eye their fields with concern. Jack rose before dawn, as he had every day since childhood, moving through his morning routine with practiced efficiency. Coffee brewing, rusty fed, weather report checked, and a hearty breakfast of eggs and hash browns to fuel the day's labor. Jack's kitchen radio crackled with the local station's morning farm report as he pulled on his worn work boots. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Farmers across Mesa County should prepare for what meteorologists are calling a potentially significant storm system, the announcer warned. The National Weather Service has issued a flash flood warning beginning this afternoon, with accumulations of 2 to 4 inches possible. Montrose Creek is expected to crest at least 2 feet above flood stage. Jack frowned, moving to the kitchen window. The heavy sky betrayed every sign of the coming deluge, but he'd lived in Colorado long enough to know that weather forecasters often exaggerated. Still, he couldn't take chances. Not with his entire future riding on this crop. He grabbed his weather-beaten notebook from the kitchen drawer, the latest in a series of farm journals that stretched back to his great-grandfather's time. Each Thornton man had kept meticulous records of plantings, harvests, weather patterns, and costs. Jack flipped to his most recent calculations, studying the numbers that would determine his future. The corn crop covered 120 acres of his 180-acre farm. At current market prices, and with the exceptional yield the drought-resistant variety promised, he would clear enough to make the overdue loan payments, with a small cushion for spring planting. But only if he could harvest before any major weather event, only if the storms held off just a little longer, only if luck was finally on his side. The margins were razor-thin, leaving no room for error or bad luck, both of which had been in abundant supply these past few years. 3 consecutive seasons of unpredictable weather had depleted his financial reserves. The unexpected breakdown of his aging combine last fall had forced him to rent equipment at exorbitant rates. And all the while, the bank's patience had worn thinner with each late payment and request for extension. Jack closed the notebook with a decisive snap. If the storm was coming today, he needed to prepare immediately. He quickly calculated what he could do to protect the most vulnerable sections of his fields. Outside, Rusty bounded ahead of Jack as they made their way toward the corn that stood in neat rows stretching toward the eastern tree line. The morning air felt unusually still and heavy, the calm before the inevitable storm. Jack walked the perimeter, stopping occasionally to examine the corn with experienced hands. "Almost there, aren't you?" he murmured, running his fingers along the developing ears. The crop wasn't quite ready. Another week would yield the perfect harvest, but parts of the easternmost section were further along than others. Jack made rapid calculations as he walked. With his ancient harvester, he could perhaps salvage 20 acres before the heavy rain hit. Not enough to satisfy the bank entirely, but perhaps enough to demonstrate good faith, enough to buy more time. His cell phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. The screen showed Alan Peterson's name from Western Colorado Bank, and Jack's stomach tightened. When the bank called this early, it was rarely good news. "Mr. Peterson," he answered, trying to keep his voice neutral. "Jack!" The banker's tone was professionally cordial, but with an unmistakable edge of finality. "I've just come from the loan committee meeting. I wanted to call you personally before the official notice is sent." Jack stopped walking, his free, hand instinctively gripping a nearby corn stalk. "What notice?" "I'm sorry, Jack." For the first time in their long acquaintance, Alan used his first name, a shift that signaled the conversation had moved beyond business. The committee has voted unanimously to deny any further extensions. Your final payment is due September 30th, as stipulated in your last agreement. If payment isn't received in full by close of business that day, foreclosure proceedings will begin October 1st. The corn stalk bent slightly in Jack's grip. "Alan, you know the situation. The crop is almost ready. I just need—" "It's out of my hands," he interrupted gently. "The decision is final. With this weather system moving in, well, the committee felt the risk was too high. I truly am sorry." After the call ended, Jack stood motionless at the edge of his field, the phone still clutched in his hand. Around him, the corn he'd nurtured from seed stood in perfect rows, oblivious to the economic forces threatening their caretaker. Rusty circled back, sensing Jack's distress, and pressed against his leg with a soft whine. "It's okay, boy," Jack said automatically, though nothing was okay at all. The reality he'd been fighting finally crashed over him in waves he could no longer hold back. Unless a miracle occurred in less than a month, Thornton Family Farms would belong to Western Colorado. 4 generations of history, struggle, triumph, and tradition would end with him. Jack Thornton would be the last of his name to work this land. He looked around at the fields his family had tended for nearly a century, where his father had taught him to drive a tractor at age 8, where his grandfather had weathered the Dust Bowl by switching to heartier crops, where his great-grandfather had staked his claim and built a legacy from nothing. "I'm sorry," he whispered, though to whom, his ancestors, the land itself, or his own future, he couldn't say. By mid-morning, the distant rumble of thunder confirmed what the dark sky had been promising for hours. Jack had formulated a desperate plan. He would attempt an early harvest on the most mature section of his corn before the deluge hit. It wouldn't be enough to save the farm, but it might provide leverage for one final appeal to the bank. He spent hours preparing his harvester, repairing and adjusting every component to ensure it would run efficiently in the race against the approaching storm. As the first raindrops began to fall, Jack paused his work to answer another call, this time from Susan. "Just checking that you're preparing for this storm," his sister said without preamble. "They're saying it could be the worst in decades. David and I want you to come stay with us until it passes." Jack glanced at the harvester he'd just spent hours readying. "Can't do that. I'm planning to salvage what I can before it hits full force." There was a long silence on the line. "Jack, that's not safe. You know how quickly the lower fields flood when Montrose Creek rises." "Don't have much choice," Jack replied, his voice flat. "Got a call from Alan Peterson this morning. Committees denied any more extensions. Payments due September 30th, or they start foreclosure October 1st. Another silence, heavier this time. "I'm sorry, Jack, we could still—" "No," Jack cut her off. "We've been through this. I'm not taking your money, Susan. It's not just my money, it's family money, and this is a family farm." Susan rarely raised her voice, and the emotion in it now caught Jack off guard. "It's my responsibility," he said more gently. "Has been since Dad died. I took it on, and I'll see it through, whatever that means. Stubbornness isn't going to save the farm," Susan said, frustration edging into her voice. "Maybe not," Jack replied, "but it's all I've got left." He ended the call before Susan could respond, knowing he'd been harsh but unable to face her concern or offers of help. Not today. By early afternoon, the rain was falling in earnest, driven by an increasingly powerful wind. The weather radar showed the worst of the storm still hours away, but already small rivulets had begun forming between the rows of corn. Jack worked frantically on his harvester, trying to get the old machine operational in deteriorating conditions. As he worked, the sky continued to darken until it was as dim as twilight, despite being only 3 in the afternoon. The wind intensified, bending the tops of the cottonwood trees that lined Montrose Creek. Lightning flashed with increasing frequency, followed by crashes of thunder that seemed to shake the very ground. Rusty had retreated to the barn, the dog's natural instincts recognizing a danger Jack was deliberately ignoring. Jack had just finished the final adjustments on the harvester when his phone chimed with an emergency alert. Flash flood warning. Immediate evacuation ordered for all residents near Montrose Creek and tributaries. Life-threatening flooding imminent. He glanced toward the creek that bordered his eastern fields. Already he could see it had risen considerably, the normally placid water now a churning, angry brown. The lowest lying section of his farm would be the first to flood if the creek breached its banks. Common sense told Jack to secure what he could and retreat to higher ground, either his farmhouse, which stood on a slight rise, or even better, to follow the evacuation order and head to town. But the thought of abandoning his equipment, his crops, his last chance to salvage something from this disaster kept him rooted in place, watching the rapidly deteriorating conditions with a mixture of fear and defiance. That's when he heard it, faint but unmistakable over the roar of the storm, a car horn blaring repeatedly in the universal signal of distress. Jack turned toward the sound, squinting through the sheets of rain. It seemed to be coming from the county road that ran along the southern edge of his property, near where it crossed over a low bridge spanning Montrose Creek. Every survival instinct told Jack to ignore the sound, to focus on saving what he could of his own livelihood. In these conditions, the creek would be rising rapidly, and venturing near it would be foolhardy at best, potentially fatal at worst. He had already prepared his harvester, the bare minimum he would need to salvage something from his crops. But something deeper than self-preservation moved Jack's feet in the direction of the distress call. His father's voice echoed in his memory. In places like this, where help might be an hour away even in good weather, looking out for your neighbors isn't charity, it's survival. The journey to the road was treacherous. Within minutes, Jack was soaked to the skin despite his rain gear. The wind howled around him, driving the rain horizontally with such force it stung his face. What should have been a 10-minute walk stretched to nearly 20 as he struggled through fields rapidly turning to mud, occasionally sinking ankle-deep in the saturated soil. When he finally reached the county road, the scene confirmed his worst fears. Montrose Creek had indeed risen dramatically, and the rushing water was now lapping at the underside of the bridge. Just beyond the bridge, partially in the water, was a luxury SUV. A sleek black Range Rover, clearly not built for rural Colorado backroads, despite its all-wheel drive. City car, city driver, Jack thought grimly as he approached. But as the true danger of the situation became apparent, concern overrode judgment. The vehicle had slid partially off the road, its front end pointing downward toward the swollen creek. The water was already reaching the front tires, and with each passing minute, the force of the current was nudging the SUV closer to the point where it might be swept away entirely. The horn had stopped, which worried Jack. Either the battery had died or the driver had given up. Neither was a good sign. "Hello!" Jack shouted as he approached, his voice barely audible above the storm's fury. "Anyone there?" He reached the driver's side door and peered through the rain-streaked window. What he saw made his blood run cold. A man in the driver's seat appeared dazed and semi-conscious, blood trickling from a cut on his forehead. In the Yardie backseat, strapped into a child's safety seat, was a boy of perhaps 10 or 11, wide-eyed with terror. Jack pounded on the window, startling the man into awareness. The driver turned with an expression of desperate hope, fumbling to unlock the door as recognition of rescue penetrated his shock. "Thank God," the man gasped as Jack wrenched the door open against the wind. The road, it was fine 1 minute, then underwater the next. I tried to brake, but we hydroplaned and, "Are you hurt badly?" Jack cut in, assessing the situation quickly. The gash on the man's head was bleeding freely, but didn't appear life-threatening. More concerning was the vehicle's position, which was becoming more precarious by the minute as the creek continued to rise. "I think I hit my head on the steering wheel," the man said, touching his wound gingerly. "But my son, can you help?" "My son?" Jack glanced again at the boy in the back seat. The child was clearly terrified, but physically unharmed. "What's your name, buddy?" Jack asked, trying to keep his voice calm and reassuring, despite the urgency of the situation. "Ethan," the boy whispered, his voice barely audible over the storm. "Okay, Ethan, I'm Jack, and we're going to get you and your dad out of here. But you need to be brave. Can you do that?" The boy nodded solemnly, his eyes never leaving Jack's face. Jack turned back to the father. "Can you walk? We need to move quickly. This bridge isn't going to hold much longer, and your vehicle could be swept away any minute." The man nodded, though uncertainty flickered across his face. "I think so. I'm Theodore, by the way. Theodore Blackwood. We were trying to reach our property up in the mountains before the worst of the storm hit. GPS routed us this way as a shortcut." The name stirred a vague sense of recognition in Jack, but there was no time to place it. Montrose Creek was visibly rising, water now reaching halfway up the SUV's front tires. Jack reached past Theodore to unbuckle his seatbelt. "Let's get your son first, then I'll help you. We need to head to my farmhouse. It's on higher ground about half a mile from here." Moving quickly but carefully, Jack opened the rear door and unbuckled Ethan from his booster seat. The boy immediately wrapped his arms around Jack's neck, clinging with the desperate strength of a frightened child. Jack lifted him out, acutely aware of how the SUV shifted slightly with the movement. "It's okay, buddy," he murmured to Ethan. "I've got you." With the boy secure in his arms, Jack helped Theodore out of the driver's seat. The man was unsteady but mobile, grimacing with pain as he moved. "I think my ankle might be sprained," he admitted as he leaned against the vehicle for support. Jack assessed their options rapidly. The direct route back to his farmhouse would take them across his fields, which were rapidly becoming a quagmire. Theodore, injured as he was, would struggle to make it through in these conditions. The road, while slightly longer, might offer firmer footing, but only if the bridge held and the creek didn't rise further. The decision was made for him as a massive crack echoed through the storm's din. Jack turned to see water surging over the bridge, pieces of its wooden structure beginning to splinter under the force of the current. "Road's not an option," he shouted to Theodore. "We'll have to go through my fields. Can you make it if I help you?" Theodore nodded grimly, his arm going around Jack's shoulders as they began to move away from the vehicle. Jack carried Ethan in one arm while supporting Theodore with the other, their progress painfully slow against the wind and rain. They had made it perhaps 100 yards from the SUV when a roar, louder than the thunder, made them all turn. The surge of water had finally overcome the bridge's resistance. With a sound like artillery fire, the structure broke apart. Massive wooden beams swept away like twigs in the current. The Range Rover, untethered from stable ground, began to slide inexorably toward the flood. "My laptop," Theodore said suddenly, his face paling. "My phone, my briefcase, everything's still in there." Before Jack could respond, Theodore pulled away, turning back toward the rapidly disappearing vehicle. "No!" Jack shouted, grabbing the man's arm. "It's gone. Nothing in there is worth your life." For a moment, Theodore looked like he might argue, his eyes fixed on the luxury vehicle now half submerged in the churning waters. Then he looked at his son, still clinging to Jack's neck, and the fight went out of him. "You're right," he said, barely audible over the storm. "Let's go." The journey across Jack's fields was nightmarish. The rain had transformed the once firm soil into treacherous mud that sucked at their feet with every step. Theodore stumbled, repeatedly, each time requiring more of Jack's strength to remain upright. Ethan, though small for his age, grew heavier in Jack's arms as the distance stretched before them. The wind was now so strong, it drove the rain horizontally, making it nearly impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. Jack navigated by instinct and memory, using the faint outline of his old barn as a landmark when it occasionally emerged. From the curtain of water, about halfway to the farmhouse, they came to a drainage ditch that normally marked the boundary between Jack's cornfields and his fallow land. Today, it had become a rushing stream, swollen with rainwater to a width of nearly 6 feet. "We have to cross," Jack shouted over the wind. "I'll take Ethan first, then come back for you." Theodore nodded, clearly exhausted and in pain. Jack stepped carefully into the water, testing each footfall before committing his weight. The current was surprisingly strong, pulling at his legs. As the water rose to his knees, then his thighs, Ethan whimpered, his arms tightening around Jack's neck. "It's okay, buddy," Jack assured him. "Just a little water. Nothing we can't handle." With careful, deliberate steps, Jack made it across the makeshift stream, setting Ethan down on slightly higher ground. "Stay right here," he instructed the boy firmly. "Don't move. I'm going to get your dad." Jack turned back to help Theodore, who was watching anxiously from the other side. The water seemed to have risen even in those few minutes, now nearly reaching Jack's waist at the deepest point. He extended his hand toward Theodore, bracing himself against the current. "Step." "Exactly where I step," Jack instructed. "It's not too deep, but the current is strong." Theodore nodded, gripping Jack's hand with surprising strength as he stepped into the water, his face contorted with pain as his injured ankle took weight, but he pressed forward, following Jack's guidance. They were nearly across when Theodore's foot slipped on the muddy bottom. He lurched forward with a cry of pain, his full weight suddenly pulling on Jack's arm. Jack staggered, but managed to keep them both upright, hauling Theodore the last few feet to safety. "Almost there," Jack encouraged, helping Theodore across the final stretch of field toward the farmhouse, now visible through the rain. "Just a little further." By the time they reached the farmhouse porch, all three were exhausted, soaked to the skin, and coated in mud. Rusty greeted them with anxious barking, circling around their legs as they staggered through the front door into the blessed shelter of the house. "Dry clothes first," Jack said, helping Theodore to a kitchen chair. "Then I'll look at that cut in the ankle." He quickly found clothes for both Theodore and Ethan. His own would be too large for the boy, but an old sweatshirt would serve as a makeshift robe until their own clothes could be dried. While they changed, Jack lit a fire in the wood stove, grateful that he had stacked firewood indoors as part of his storm preparations. Once Theodore and Ethan were settled by the fire, wrapped in the quilts Jack's grandmother had made decades ago, Jack brought out his first aid kit and carefully cleaned the cut on Theodore's forehead. "Doesn't look like it needs stitches," he said, applying antiseptic cream and a bandage. "But you'll have quite a headache. How's the ankle?" Theodore flexed his foot cautiously. "Painful, but I don't think it's broken, just a bad sprain." He looked up at Jack, his expression solemn. "You saved our lives out there. I don't even know how to begin to thank you." Jack shook his head, uncomfortable with gratitude. Anyone would have done the same. "No," Theodore said firmly. "Not anyone would wade into a flash flood to rescue strangers. Most people would have called 911 and waited for emergency services, which might not have reached us in time." There was something in Theodore's manner, a quiet authority, an articulate precision that didn't match Jack's initial impression of a lost city driver. Now, in the light of the kitchen, Jack could see that Theodore's clothes, though soaked and muddy, were expensive and well-tailored. His watch alone probably cost more than Jack's truck. "You said your name is Theodore Blackwood?" Jack asked, a memory stirring. "I've heard that name somewhere." Theodore smiled slightly. "Perhaps in the business section. I'm the founder and CEO of Nexus Technologies." Jack's eyes widened in recognition. Nexus Technologies was one of the largest tech companies in the world, specializing in artificial intelligence and quantum computing. Even in his isolated corner of rural Colorado, Jack had read about their groundbreaking work. "The AI company?" Jack asked, unable to hide his surprise. Theodore nodded. "Among other things, we were on our way to our retreat in the mountains. I tried to take Ethan there a few times a year, get him away from screens and into nature." He glanced ruefully at his son, now dozing by the fire, exhausted from the ordeal. "Not my brightest idea, as it turned out." Before Jack could respond, a loud crash from outside made them both jump. Jack rushed to the window to see one of the massive cottonwood trees that lined his driveway now fallen across his harvester, the machine he'd spent hours readying before the storm hit, his last hope of salvaging some of his crop before the bank's deadline. The sight hit him like a physical blow. That harvester, old and unreliable as it was, had represented his last chance of showing the bank he was making an effort, his last possibility of buying a little more time. Now it lay crushed beneath tons of wood, as unreachable as the rest of his fields currently disappearing under the rising floodwaters. "Problem?" Theodore asked, noting Jack's stricken expression. Jack turned away from the window, composing his features. "Nothing that can be helped now," he said, his voice deliberately steady. "Storm's getting worse. We should settle in for a long night." As he moved around the kitchen, preparing coffee and a simple meal from his pantry supplies, Jack was acutely aware that outside, his livelihood was being systematically destroyed. The fields he'd nurtured with such care would be ruined, his plants uprooted or drowned, the soil itself possibly washed away in the worst sections. By morning, the last slim chance he had of saving his family farm would be gone. Yet as he glanced at Ethan sleeping peacefully by the fire, his father watching over him with transparent love and gratitude, Jack couldn't bring himself to regret his choice. Some things were more valuable than land or legacy. Looking at the child he'd helped save, Jack knew he'd made the right decision, the only decision a Thornton could make. Night fell early, hastened by the storm's dark clouds. The old farmhouse creaked and groaned as wind battered its walls, but the sturdy structure built by Jack's great-grandfather stood firm against nature's onslaught. Inside, the warm glow of kerosene lamps illuminated the kitchen, the electricity having failed an hour earlier. Ethan had fallen into exhausted sleep on the living room sofa, wrapped in quilts with Rusty curled protectively at his feet. The border collie had taken an immediate liking to the boy, seemingly appointing himself Ethan's guardian for the duration of their stay. "He's good with your son," Jack observed, nodding toward Rusty as he poured another cup of coffee for Theodore. "Ethan's always wanted a dog," Theodore replied, warming his hands around the mug. "Our building in San Francisco doesn't allow pets, and with my travel schedule." He trailed off, his gaze lingering on his sleeping child. "I keep telling myself we'll get a place with a yard someday when things slow down." Jack nodded, recognizing the familiar refrain of deferred dreams. "Things never slow down unless you make them," he said, then immediately regretted the presumption. To his surprise, Theodore smiled ruefully. "My wife used to say the same thing before she passed. 3 years ago next month." "I'm sorry," Jack said quietly. "My wife left 8 years ago. Different circumstances, but I understand the adjustment." The two men fell into a companionable silence, listening to the storm rage outside. Through the kitchen window, occasional flashes of lightning illuminated Jack's fields, revealing glimpses of the devastation being wrought. Each flash was like a knife to Jack's heart, but he kept his expression neutral, unwilling to burden his guests with his troubles. "Your farm," Theodore said suddenly, his gaze following Jack's to the window. "How bad will the damage be?" Jack hesitated, then decided honesty was simpler than evasion. Total loss, most likely. The fields are in the lowest part of the property. Even a normal heavy rain can cause temporary flooding in spots. He gestured toward the window as thunder crashed overhead. "This will wash away most of what I planted. What isn't washed away will be drowned." "Insurance?" Theodore asked. Jack gave a short, humorless laugh. "Basic coverage for the buildings and equipment, not for crop loss from weather events. Premiums were too high for my operating budget." Theodore nodded thoughtfully, his expression revealing nothing. "And this was to be your main harvest for the year?" "It was my last chance," Jack admitted, the weight of the situation finally finding voice. "Farm's been struggling for years. Smaller operations like mine can't compete with corporate agriculture anymore. Banks don't see us as viable investments." He stared into his coffee, surprised at how easily he was sharing details he'd kept hidden even from Susan. "I had until the end of September to make a payment or face foreclosure. That corn was my only shot." For a long moment, Theodore said nothing, his eyes studying Jack with an intensity that made him slightly uncomfortable. Finally, the CEO spoke, his voice quiet but clear even over the storm's fury. "You knew all this when you left your fields to help us," he said. "It wasn't a question." Jack shrugged, embarrassed by the implied praise. "Your lives mattered more than corn." "Most people would say that," Theodore observed. "Few would actually live it when faced with losing everything." Before Jack could respond, his cell phone rang, startling them both as service had been spotty at best since the storm began. The screen showed Susan's name, and Jack answered quickly. "Jack, thank..." "Oh God," his sister's voice came through thick with relief. "We've been trying to reach you for hours. The news is showing catastrophic flooding all through the county. Are you okay?" "I'm fine," Jack assured her. "Power's out, but the house is holding up. Got a couple of unexpected guests riding out. The storm with me." He explained briefly about the rescue, downplaying the danger and his own role in it. Throughout the call, Theodore watched him with that same thoughtful expression, occasionally sipping his coffee. "The road to your place is completely underwater, according to the emergency alerts," Susan said, after expressing appropriate amazement at Jack's rescue story. "They're saying no travel until at least tomorrow afternoon. Will you be okay for supplies?" "We'll manage," Jack said, mentally inventorying his pantry. He had always kept a well-stocked emergency supply, a habit instilled by his father and grandfather. "How are things in town?" "Some flooding in the lower sections, but our neighborhood is on high ground. David's school is being used as an emergency shelter." Susan paused, clearly hesitant to ask the question foremost in her mind. "Jack, your fields..." Jack swallowed hard. "Gone, Susan. All of it." The silence that followed was heavy with understanding. Finally, Susan spoke, her voice gentle. "We'll figure something out, Jack. The farm's been through hard times before." "Yeah," Jack agreed, knowing that this time was different but unwilling to burden his sister further. "Listen, battery's low. I should go. We'll talk tomorrow when the storm passes." After ending the call, Jack sat staring at the phone in his hand, the reality of his situation settling over him with crushing finality. 4 generations of Thorntons had weathered drought, pests, economic downturns, and personal tragedies to keep this land. Now, on his watch, it would be lost, not due to any failure of character or effort, but simply because the economics of modern agriculture had made small family farms unsustainable. "Your sister?" Theodore asked, breaking into Jack's thoughts. Jack nodded. "Worried about me, about the farm." He set the phone down, forcing himself back to the present moment and his responsibilities as a host. "Should check on that ankle of yours before we lose the light completely." Theodore allowed the change of subject, extending his leg so Jack could examine the injured ankle. The swelling had increased, and Theodore winced as Jack gently probed the area. "Definitely a sprain," Jack concluded. "I'll get some ice from the freezer while the refrigerator's still cold. Wrap it properly, and you should stay off it as much as possible." As Jack tended to Theodore's injury with the same careful attention he gave to all tasks, a strange sense of peace settled over him. The farm might be lost, his future uncertain, but in this moment he was doing exactly what his father and grandfather would have done, helping someone in need without expectation of reward. "You're good at this," Theodore observed, as Jack expertly wrapped the ankle with an elastic bandage. "When you live 30 miles from the nearest doctor, you learn to handle things yourself," Jack shrugged. "My grandmother was the unofficial medic for half the county, taught me everything from setting broken fingers to delivering calves." "A valuable skill set," Theodore said thoughtfully, "increasingly rare in our specialized world." Jack secured the bandage and stood, moving to check on Ethan before turning in for the night. The boy was sleeping soundly, his face peaceful despite the storm's continued rage outside. "He's resilient," Jack said, as Theodore limped over to watch his son. Theodore nodded, gently brushing a strand of hair from Ethan's forehead. "After his mother died, I worried he'd never feel secure again, but children have a remarkable capacity for healing, for moving forward." He glanced at Jack. "Sometimes I think they understand better than adults what truly matters." The simple truth of this observation struck Jack deeply. He thought of how he'd clung to the farm, even as it slowly pulled him under, how he'd isolated himself with his grief and pride, rejecting Susan's offers of help and connection. "I'll make up the spare room for you," Jack said suddenly, needing a moment alone to process the day's events and revelations. In the spare bedroom that had once belonged to his parents, Jack changed the sheets and found extra blankets, his mind churning with thoughts of the past and uncertain future. The family photos on the dresser seemed to watch him, his grandfather and father in their prime, standing proudly before bountiful harvests, his mother in her garden, Jack himself as a boy learning to drive the tractor under his father's watchful eye. "I tried," he whispered to those frozen faces. "I really tried." When he returned to the living room, he found Theodore standing at the window, staring out into the storm-lashed darkness. The CEO turned at Jack's approach, his expression unreadable in the lamplight. "Room's ready when you want it," Jack said. "Not fancy, but dry and warm." Theodore nodded his thanks, but made no move toward the bedroom. Instead, he asked a question that caught Jack completely off guard. "Have you considered alternative uses for your land beyond traditional crop farming?" Jack blinked, surprised by the sudden shift to business. "Such as?" "Nexus Technologies has been developing a network of quantum computing data centers. We're looking to decentralize our operations, moving away from massive facilities in tech hubs towards smaller, more energy-efficient centers spread across rural America." Theodore spoke with increasing animation, his entrepreneurial passion evident despite his exhaustion. Ideally, these sites would be working farms with established infrastructure and experienced local operators who understand both the agricultural legacy and the potential for technological integration. Jack listened with growing confusion, uncertain why Theodore was sharing this information. Sounds like something that would interest the big corporate operations. Theodore shook his head emphatically. "That's exactly what we don't want. Corporate farms already have complex infrastructures and bureaucracies. We're looking to partner with independent family operations, farms with deep community roots and the flexibility to innovate." He fixed Jack with an intent gaze. "Farms exactly like yours." A flicker of something, Not quite hope, but perhaps its distant cousin, stirred in Jack's chest. He quickly suppressed it, wary of misunderstanding or reading too much into casual conversation. "My farm won't be mine much longer," he reminded Theodore. "Foreclosure is set for the end of September, and after tonight, there's nothing left to sell or bargain with." "Perhaps," Theodore acknowledged. "Or perhaps there's another possibility we could discuss when we're both less exhausted and my son isn't sleeping 10 feet away." He smiled slightly, extending his hand to Jack. "For now, I'll just say thank you again for our lives, and good night." Jack shook Theodore's hand, noting the firm grip and direct eye contact. His father had always said you could judge a man's character by these simple metrics. "Good night," he replied. "We'll see what morning brings." As Theodore limped to the spare bedroom, Jack settled into his father's old recliner near the sofa where Ethan slept. Rusty readjusted his position at the boy's feet, looking up at Jack with what seemed like canine approval. "Don't get too attached," Jack murmured to the dog. "They'll be gone as soon as the road's clear." Outside, the storm continued its assault, but its fury seemed to be lessening slightly. Jack listened to the rhythm of the rain, his mind replaying Theodore's strange comments about data centers and partnerships. Was it just the polite conversation of a grateful man, or something more? Jack didn't allow himself to dwell on the possibility. Hope was a luxury he couldn't afford right now. Better to focus on the present moment, on getting his guests safely back to civilization once the flooding receded. Whatever came after, the foreclosure, the loss of his heritage, the uncertain future, he would face it with the same stubborn resilience that had carried him this far. As exhaustion finally overcame him, Jack's last conscious thought was of his great-grandfather's compass, now sitting on the kitchen table. 4 generations of Thornton men had navigated by its guidance, finding their way through the darkest of times. Perhaps it still had one more journey to chart. Jack awoke with a start, momentarily disoriented to find himself in the recliner rather than his bed. Sunlight streamed through the windows. Bright, clear light that signaled the storm had finally passed. For a split second, he experienced the simple pleasure of a beautiful morning before memory crashed over him. The storm, the flood, the rescue, the farm. The sound of childish laughter drew his attention to the kitchen. Jack rose stiffly from the chair, his body protesting the night spent in the uncomfortable position. Rusty was nowhere to be seen, but the tantalizing aroma of coffee guided Jack toward the kitchen, where he found an unexpected scene of domestic tranquility. Ethan sat at the kitchen table, giggling, as Rusty performed a series of tricks for small bits of breakfast sausage. Theodore stood at the stove, somehow managing to cook eggs, despite his injured ankle. The CEO had found Jack's rarely used apron and looked surprisingly at home in the rural kitchen, a far cry from the corporate boardrooms where Jack imagined he usually spent his mornings. "Hope you don't mind," Theodore said, noticing Jack's arrival. "We were hungry and you were sleeping so soundly we didn't want to wake you." "Not at all," Jack replied, genuinely touched by the consideration and surprised they'd found anything to cook. "I'm not known for keeping a gourmet pantry," Theodore smiled, transferring eggs onto 3 plates. "Farm kitchens always have the essentials. My grandfather had a place in rural Montana. Spent my summers there as a boy. Some skills you never forget." Jack poured himself coffee from the percolator. Theodore had even figured out how to use the old stovetop model in the absence of electricity, and joined Ethan at the table. The boy looked remarkably recovered from yesterday's ordeal, his face bright with the resilience of childhood. "Your dog knows lots of tricks," Ethan informed Jack seriously. "I taught him to high-five." Jack raised an eyebrow at Rusty, who had never shown any interest in performing tricks for him. "Is that so? Seems he's been holding out on me all these years." Ethan giggled, then demonstrated by holding out his hand. "High five, Rusty." The collie promptly raised his paw to tap the boy's palm, looking inordinately pleased with himself. Theodore set their breakfast on the table, then joined them, wincing slightly as he settled his weight onto the chair. "How's it looking outside?" he asked, nodding toward the window. Jack had been deliberately avoiding looking too closely at the view, but now he forced himself to assess the damage in the clear morning light. What he saw confirmed his worst fears. The lower fields were still partially submerged, with only the tops of some cornstalks visible above muddy water. The section nearest the creek had been completely washed away, leaving nothing but churned earth. His harvester remained pinned beneath the fallen cottonwood, crushed beyond any hope of repair. "About what I expected," Jack said, keeping his voice neutral for Ethan's benefit. "Water's receding, but the damage is done." Theodore studied him for a moment, then turned to his son. "Ethan, why don't you take Rusty outside for a few minutes? Stay on the porch where we can see you." The boy looked between the two men, sensing the adult conversation to come, but nodded agreeably. "Come on, Rusty," he called, and the dog followed him eagerly to the door. Once Ethan was out of earshot, Theodore's expression grew serious. "I made a few calls while you were sleeping. Cell service is patchy, but I managed to reach my assistant. They're sending a helicopter as soon as the weather permits, probably within the hour." Jack nodded, unsurprised. A man of Theodore's position would have resources at his disposal that most people couldn't imagine. "Good. The roads will be impassable for days. You and Ethan should get back to civilization as soon as possible." "About what I mentioned last night," Theodore continued, his tone shifting to something more formal, more businesslike. "The data center concept. I was serious, Jack." Jack took a long sip of his coffee, buying time to formulate a response that wouldn't sound either pathetically eager or ungratefully dismissive. "It's an interesting idea," he said finally, "but the timing's not great. Even if I wanted to explore it, the bank won't wait. By the time any partnership could be arranged, this land won't be mine anymore." Theodore leaned forward, his eyes intent. "What if I could buy you some time? A word from me to your bank might—" "No," Jack interrupted firmly. "I appreciate the thought, I really do, but I can't accept that kind of help." "It's not charity, Jack," Theodore said, leaning forward. "It's business. Nexus needs rural data center locations, and your farm has exactly the conditions we're looking for. Stable ground, access to renewable energy potential, proximity to fiber optic lines, and community integration." Jack shook his head, pride warring with the desperate desire to save his family's legacy. "Theodore, you don't even know if my land is suitable for whatever technology you're developing. You haven't seen soil samples, reviewed water rights, checked zoning regulations. This is emotion talking, not business sense." Theodore sat back, regarding Jack with an expression that somehow mixed frustration and respect. "Fair enough. I'm offering something without due diligence, which isn't my usual approach." He reached into his wallet, extracting a business card, which he placed on the table between them. "But the offer stands. Think about it. Do your own research on Nexus and call me when you're ready to discuss it properly." Jack looked at the card, but made no move to take it. "Why?" he asked simply. "Why me? Why this farm?" Theodore's expression softened. "Because yesterday, when faced with losing everything you've worked for, you didn't hesitate to risk your life for complete strangers. That says something about your character, something rare and valuable in my experience. People who operate from that core of integrity make the best partners." Before Jack could respond, the distinctive sound of helicopter blades broke the morning. "Quiet." Theodore rose, moving to the window that looked out over the front yard. "That's our ride," he said, turning back to Jack. "Will you at least keep the card? No obligation, just a door left open." This time, Jack took the card, slipping it into his shirt pocket without looking at it. "For what it's worth, I hope it works out with your data centers. Small operations are disappearing too fast in this country. The sound of the helicopter grew louder as it approached, circling once before settling in the relatively flat area of Jack's front yard. Ethan came racing back into the house, excitement overcoming his usual reserve. "Dad, it's a helicopter! Is it for us?" Theodore nodded, smiling at his son's enthusiasm. "It is. Go get your things, buddy. It's time to go home." As Ethan scampered off to collect his still damp original clothes, Theodore turned to Jack, extending his hand. "I meant what I said. Before, you saved our lives yesterday. That's a debt that can't be repaid with a simple thank you." Jack shook the offered hand firmly. "No debt, just glad I was there." The goodbyes were brief, but heartfelt. Ethan hugged Rusty with such emotion that Jack feared the boy might start crying, but he rallied quickly when the helicopter pilot stepped into the house, a professional-looking woman in a flight suit who introduced herself as Captain Reeves. "We need to move quickly, Mr. Blackwood," she informed them. "There's another weather system moving in later today, and we have a narrow window for safe extraction." Theodore nodded, then turned to Jack one last time. "The card," he said, tapping his own chest where Jack had pocketed the business card. "Promise me you'll think about it." Jack nodded, not trusting himself to speak. A strange sense of loss swept over him as he watched Theodore help Ethan into a jacket provided by the pilot. These people had entered his life so briefly, yet somehow their departure left a larger void than seemed reasonable. At the door, Ethan turned back suddenly, breaking away from his father to run to Jack. The boy threw his arms around Jack's waist in a fierce hug. "Thank you for saving us," he said, his voice muffled against Jack's shirt. "And for letting Rusty sleep with me." Jack knelt, bringing himself to eye level with the child. "You're welcome, Ethan. You take care of your dad, okay? Make sure he rests that ankle." Ethan nodded solemnly. "I will. Maybe we can come back someday and visit Rusty." Jack glanced up at Theodore, who was watching them with an unreadable expression. "Maybe so," Jack said, though he wondered if by then the farm would belong to someone else. With final waves, Theodore and Ethan boarded the helicopter, the rotors, spinning up to a deafening roar as Jack and Rusty retreated to the porch. They watched as the aircraft lifted smoothly into the clear blue sky, banked once in a farewell circle over the farm, then headed westward until it was merely a speck on the horizon. The sudden silence felt oppressive. With their visitors gone, Jack was left alone with the reality of his situation. He walked slowly to the edge of his property where the damage was most visible, Rusty trailing behind him with uncharacteristic solemnity, as if the dog too understood what had been lost. The cornfields were a disaster beyond anything Jack had anticipated. Where neat rows had stood just yesterday, there was now only mud, debris, and occasional glimpses of plants uprooted and broken. The irrigation system he'd spent years piecing together was completely destroyed. Pipes torn from the ground, sprinkler heads missing, the main pump submerged and surely ruined. Jack estimated it would take weeks just to clear the debris, months to restore the soil to planting condition, and tens of thousands of dollars he didn't have to replace the equipment. Even if by some miracle the bank granted another extension, the growing season for his primary crop was effectively lost. As the full magnitude of the disaster settled over him, Jack's phone rang. It was Susan, her voice breathless with concern. "Jack, we just heard on the emergency broadcast that a helicopter was dispatched to your area. Is everything okay?" "I'm fine," Jack assured her. "The helicopter was for my guests, the ones I mentioned last night. They've gone now." "Thank goodness. Kevin and I have been so worried. The roads are still underwater, but they're saying some might be passable by tomorrow. We want to come check on you as soon as it's safe." Jack hesitated, reluctant to worry his sister further, but knowing she would discover the truth soon enough. "Susan, it's bad. The crops, the equipment, it's all gone." There was a long silence before Susan spoke again, her voice gentle but firm. "And then you'll come stay with us while you figure things out. The spare room is all ready." The offer, kindly meant, struck Jack like a physical blow. Moving to town, living on his sister's charity, it represented a final admission of defeat he wasn't ready to make. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves," he said, striving for a lightness he didn't feel. "I need to fully assess the damage first, talk to the bank, see what options might be available." Jack Thornton," Susan said, and he could picture her standing with one hand on her hip, the way she did when preparing to deliver a lecture. "This isn't the time for pride. You've done everything humanly possible to save that farm. If it can't be saved, that's not on you." Jack gazed across the ruined fields to the farmhouse in the distance, the home his great-grandfather had built, where 4 generations of Thorntons had been born and raised. "I hear you," he said finally, "but I'm not ready to walk away, not yet." After ending the call with promises to keep Susan updated, Jack made his way back to the house. Rusty trotted ahead, seemingly eager to leave behind the mud and destruction for the familiar comfort of the farmhouse. Jack paused on the porch, struck by a sudden memory of his father standing in this exact spot after a particularly devastating hailstorm that had destroyed an entire wheat crop. "Nature can take it all away in an hour," his father had said, "but the land remains. As long as we have the land, we have a future." Jack wondered if his father would still believe that in today's agricultural economy, where small farmers were being squeezed out by massive corporate operations and foreign imports, the land might remain, but its value, at least as a traditional family farm, seemed increasingly questionable. Inside, Jack found himself drawn to the kitchen table where Theodore had left his business card. He studied it properly for the first time. Expensive cardstock, understated design, the Nexus Technologies logo in subtle blue. Theodore Blackwood, CEO and founder, with a direct line and email. Nothing flashy or ostentatious, yet it somehow conveyed the substantial resources behind it. Jack set the card aside and pulled out his leather-bound farm journal, turning to the financial calculations he'd made just days ago. The numbers stared back at him, stark and unforgiving. Even before the flood, he'd been operating on razor-thin margins. Now, with his crops destroyed and equipment damaged, there was simply no mathematical path to meeting the bank's deadline unless... Almost against his will, Jack found himself reaching for Theodore's card again. A partnership with Nexus Technologies would certainly bring resources and technology far beyond what Jack could access alone. But it would also mean fundamentally changing the nature of Thornton Family Farms, transforming it from a traditional agricultural operation to something new and unfamiliar. Would his father understand such a compromise, his grandfather, or would they see it as surrendering the independence that had been the cornerstone of the Thornton farming philosophy for generations? Jack placed the card carefully beside his journal and walked to the wall of family photographs. His ancestors looked back at him from their frozen moments in time. Proud, determined, unflinching in the face of challenges. But they had adapted, too. His grandfather switching from wheat to corn when the market changed, his father embracing irrigation technology when others in the county still relied solely on rainfall. "Thorntons don't quit," his grandmother always said, but she had also taught him that survival sometimes required change, adaptability, and the courage to try new approaches. As the sun climbed higher in the post-storm sky, Jack Thornton stood at the crossroads of past and future, tradition and innovation, pride and pragmatism. The farm, as he knew it, might be lost, but perhaps, just perhaps, something new could rise from the mud and debris, something that would honor the Thornton legacy while securing its future in a changing world. The business card seemed to take on weight far beyond its paper and ink, representing a choice Jack had never anticipated making. He slipped it back into his pocket, not yet ready to decide, but acknowledging the possibility it represented. For now, there was work to be done. Damage to assess, debris to clear, a path forward to discover one step at a time. With Rusty at his heels, Jack headed back outside to begin the long process of salvaging what could be saved from the storm's destruction. The helicopter that had carried Theodore and Ethan away was now long gone from the sky. Yet somehow, Jack sensed that their departure was not the end of the story, but merely the closing of one chapter and the tentative beginning of another. The days following Theodore's departure passed in a blur of exhausting labor and mounting despair. By the second day, the floodwaters had receded enough for Jack to fully assess the catastrophic damage to his farm. What he found exceeded even his worst expectations. Nearly 90% of his crops were completely destroyed. Fields that had been meticulously planted and tended for months were now barren mud pits, or worse, covered in debris carried downstream by the floodwaters. His irrigation system, pieced together over years with parts he could afford, was beyond repair. Pipes twisted and broken, pumps filled with silt. The expensive drought-resistant seed he'd invested in had been washed away along, with layers of precious topsoil that had taken generations to build. Jack worked from dawn until dusk each day, clearing what debris he could by hand, salvaging the few tools and equipment parts that might still be useful. Each night he collapsed into bed physically exhausted but mentally alert, his thoughts racing, with calculations and scenarios that always ended at the same impossible conclusion. There was no way to save Thornton Family Farms in its current form. On the third day, the roads to town were finally cleared enough for limited travel. Jack drove his old pickup into Riverdale for supplies. The small town had suffered its own damage from the flooding, though not as severely as the outlying farms. Main Street businesses were busy with cleanup, storefront windows displaying hand-painted signs declaring Mesa County strong and we'll rebuild together. Jack's first stop was the hardware store, where he hoped to find some replacement parts for his well pump. As he entered Johnson's Hardware, conversations paused and heads turned. Jack was accustomed to the familiar friendliness of small-town life, but this was different, a sort of hushed respect that made him instantly uncomfortable. Old Tom Johnson emerged from behind the counter, wiping his hands on his perpetual apron. "Jack Thornton," he said, his voice carrying through the suddenly quiet store. "Man of the hour." Jack froze, confused, as several customers moved toward him with expressions of admiration. "What?" Jack asked, glancing around. Tom gestured to the television mounted in the corner of the store, which was playing the local news on mute. On screen was a photograph Jack didn't recognize, himself standing on his porch beside Theodore and Ethan Blackwood, Rusty at the boys' feet. The caption read, "Local farmers' heroic flood rescue of tech mogul and son." "You're all over the news, Jack," Tom explained, clapping him on the shoulder. Channel 7 did a whole segment on how you risked your life, saving that billionaire fellow and his boy. Said you lost your entire crop in the process. Jack's stomach tightened with embarrassment. How did they get that story? Or that photo? "Nay, Blackwood himself released a statement," said Margaret Williams, who taught with Susan at the elementary school. "Called you an American hero who embodies the highest values of rural communities. They interviewed folks from town about you, too." Jack shook his head, deeply uncomfortable with the attention. "Just did what anyone would do." "Not anyone would have waded into floodwaters when their own livelihood was washing away," Tom countered. "Look, I know it's awkward, but people around here are proud of you, Jack. You represented the best of Mesa County on the national stage." "National?" Jack echoed, horrified. Tom nodded enthusiastically. "Oh yeah, that Blackwood fellow's a big deal. His company's worth billions. Story got picked up by the networks. Susan must be busting with pride." Jack paid for the few items, He could afford enduring the handshakes and backslaps with as much grace as he could muster. By the time he escaped the hardware store, his discomfort had evolved into a smoldering resentment. Theodore had put him in the spotlight without permission, turning a private moment of human decency into public spectacle. This resentment carried Jack to his next stop, Western Colorado Bank, where he'd requested a meeting with Alan Peterson. The bank's brick building had been spared the worst of the flooding due to its position on higher ground, though sandbags still lined the entrance as a precaution. Inside, Jack was ushered immediately into Alan's office, another departure from the usual protocol that suggested his newfound celebrity was already affecting how people treated him. "Jack," Alan greeted him, standing to shake his hand with unusual warmth. "How are you holding up? I saw the news. What you did was extraordinary." Jack took a seat, determined to keep the conversation professional despite Alan's familiarity. "My farm is destroyed," he said bluntly. "Crops gone, equipment damaged, soil compromised. I'm here to discuss realistic options before the foreclosure deadline." Alan's expression shifted from admiration to discomfort. "Yes, of course." He shuffled papers on his desk, clearly gathering his thoughts. "Jack, in light of the circumstances, both the natural disaster and your heroic actions, the loan committee has authorized me to offer a 90-day extension on your payment deadline." Jack blinked, caught off guard. 90 days? "It's the most we can do within regulatory guidelines," Alan explained. "The flooding has affected many of our agricultural clients, and the board felt it was appropriate to offer some breathing room. An extra 3 months, not salvation, but a reprieve. Time to what? The fundamental equation hadn't changed. The growing season was lost, the equipment still damaged, the soil still needing extensive rehabilitation before it could produce again." "I appreciate the gesture," Jack said finally, because some response was expected. "But I'm trying to be realistic here, Alan. Even with 90 extra days, I don't see a path to making the payment. The farm can't generate income from nothing." Alan looked genuinely pained. "I understand, Jack, and if there was more we could do." He trailed off, then leaned forward with an expression of cautious hope. "Actually, there might be something. Have you considered reaching out to Mr. Blackwood directly? From what I've seen in the news, he seems extremely grateful for what you did. A man in his position might have connections, resources." "No," Jack interrupted firmly, his earlier resentment flaring anew. "I'm not looking for charity, especially not from someone who put me on display without asking." Alan raised his hands in a placating gesture. "Just a thought. But Jack, there's no shame in accepting help when it's offered freely. Your family has been a pillar of this community for generations. People want to see Thornton Family Farms survive." Jack left the bank with the 90-day extension paperwork and a leaden feeling in his chest. The extra time was meaningless without a viable plan, and his pride rebelled at the thought of becoming an object of charity, the struggling farmer saved by the benevolent CEO he'd rescued. By the time Jack returned to the farm that afternoon, his conflict had only deepened. Susan called, bursting with excitement about his newfound fame and the possibilities it might create. Jack cut the conversation short, unable to articulate why the situation made him so deeply uncomfortable. That evening, sitting at his kitchen table with his farm ledger open before him, Jack finally took Theodore Blackwood's business card from his pocket. He'd carried it with him every day since the CEO's departure, though he hadn't seriously considered making the call. Now, with the full extent of the destruction clear and the bank's extension offering only a longer runway to the same inevitable crash, Jack found himself staring at the card for long minutes. A data center for Nexus Technologies, a partnership rather than outright loss, a way to keep the land, if not the exact operation his ancestors had built. Jack's finger hovered over his phone, pride wrestling with pragmatism. Before he could decide, A text message alert broke his concentration. It was from an unknown number, but the content made the sender immediately clear. "Jack, this is Theodore Blackwood. Hope you're well," Ethan asks about Rusty daily. "Just checking in to see if you've had a chance to consider our conversation about the data center concept. No pressure, but I have some new information that might interest you regarding your specific location suitability. Happy to discuss whenever you're ready." The casual, friendly tone somehow made Jack's resistance stronger. It felt too convenient, too much like Theodore was swooping in to save the day, now that Jack's plight was public knowledge. The fact that Theodore had clearly researched his farm's location without permission only heightened Jack's unease. He set the phone aside without responding, instead turning to the family Bible that contained records of Thornton harvests stretching back decades. Jack flipped through the pages reverently, noting his great-grandfather's precise handwriting giving way to his grandfather's more flowing script, then his father's practical notations, and finally his own entries documenting the farm's recent struggles. The Bible represented continuity, tradition, the unbroken line of Thornton's stewardship. Yet as Jack studied the entries more closely, he noticed something he'd overlooked before. Each generation had faced moments of profound change. His great-grandfather's decision to mechanize operations in the 1940s, despite community skepticism. His grandfather's controversial switch to crop rotation methods in the 1960s, when single crop farming was the accepted norm. The farm had endured not through rigid adherence to tradition, but through thoughtful adaptation while maintaining core values. What were those core values? Not the specific crops they grew or methods they used, but something deeper. Stewardship of the land, contribution to the community, integrity in their dealings, resilience in the face of challenges. Jack closed the Bible, his decision still unmade, but his perspective subtly shifting. Would it be a betrayal of the Thornton legacy to consider Theodore's offer, or might it actually be consistent with how previous generations had adapted to changing circumstances? He slept poorly that night, and the next 3 days followed a similar pattern. Jack continued clearing debris and assessing damage, his body moving through necessary tasks while his mind churned with the impossible choice. Before him, he didn't respond to Theodore's text, but neither did he delete it. On the 6th day after the flood, Jack received an unexpected visitor. Alan Peterson's car pulled up the driveway around mid-morning, the banker looking oddly formal in his suit. As he picked his way across the muddy yard to where Jack was attempting to salvage parts from his damaged tractor. "Jack!" Alan called, waving a folder. "Glad I caught you. There's something important we need to discuss." Jack wiped his hands on a rag, eyeing the banker with suspicion. Unannounced visits from the bank rarely brought good news. "What's happened? Problem with the extension?" Alan shook his head, an uncharacteristic excitement in his expression. "Actually, it's about a potential opportunity. I've been contacted by a representative from Nexus Technologies. They're interested in your property, specifically in establishing some kind of technology partnership. They asked me to give you this." He handed Jack a folder, which contained a preliminary proposal on Nexus letterhead. Jack skimmed it quickly, his pulse quickening despite his determination to remain detached. The outline described a 10-year partnership that would maintain Thornton ownership of the land while providing substantial funding for reconstruction, incorporating cutting-edge renewable energy technology, and establishing the farm as a site for a rural data center while maintaining agricultural production on portions of the property. "They've been doing their homework," Alan observed, watching Jack's face closely. "The representative I spoke with knew everything about your property. Soil, conditions, topography, even the historical crop yields. Said they'd identified your location as ideal for their rural technology initiative even before Mr. Blackwood's unexpected visit." Jack closed the folder, unsure what to think. If Theodore was telling the truth, if Thornton Farm had been on Nexus Technologies' radar before the rescue, then perhaps this wasn't charity after all, but genuine business interest. "I'll look it over," Jack said noncommittally. Alan nodded, though his expression suggested he'd hoped for more enthusiasm. "Jack, I know you're proud. God knows the Thorntons have always been proud. But this could be the answer you've been looking, or for a way to keep the land and honor your family's legacy while moving into the future." After Alan left, Jack spent hours poring over the proposal, making notes, researching Nexus Technologies' other initiatives. The more he read, the more he had to admit the plan made sense. The farm's location near a major fiber optic line, its stable bedrock, and the potential for solar and wind energy made it well suited for a data center. Under the proposed arrangement, Jack would maintain ownership and continue farming approximately 40% of the land, the most fertile sections least damaged by the flood, while Nexus would develop the remaining acreage for their technology needs. The financial terms were more than fair. The initial payment would clear his debt with the bank and provide capital for new equipment. The ongoing lease payments would ensure the farm's profitability for at least a decade. There were even provisions for training local residents for technical positions at the data center, creating jobs in a community that desperately needed them. Still, Jack hesitated. The idea of massive server buildings humming where corn had grown for generations felt wrong somehow, a betrayal of the land's purpose. Yet hadn't each generation of Thorntons redefined that purpose according to the needs of their time? His internal debate continued for days, weighing tradition against survival, sentimentality against pragmatism. He discussed the proposal with Susan, who was cautiously optimistic, and consulted with David, whose environmental science background helped Jack understand the potential ecological impacts. 1 week after receiving the proposal, Jack still hadn't given Alan an answer or responded to Theodore's text. He awoke early as always, performed his morning chores, then sat at the kitchen table with his great-grandfather's compass in his hand, turning it over and over as if it might somehow point him toward the right decision. The sound of vehicles on his gravel driveway pulled Jack from his thoughts. Looking out the window, he was astonished to see not one car, but a procession turning onto his property. Sleek black SUVs, at least a dozen of them, followed by what appeared to be large transport trucks. Rusty began barking frantically, racing to the door as Jack stepped onto the porch, confusion and alarm battling in his mind. The lead SUV pulled to a stop, and a familiar figure emerged. Theodore Blackwood, his ankle apparently healed, dressed not in the casual clothes of their last meeting, but in an impeccable suit that marked him unmistakably as the billionaire. CEO he was. Behind him, men and women in similar business attire exited other vehicles, while the trucks continued past the house toward the eastern fields. "Jack!" Theodore called, striding forward with extended hand. "I hope you'll forgive the unannounced visit. Sometimes showing is more effective than telling." Jack shook Theodore's hand automatically, too stunned to do otherwise. "What is all this?" he asked, gesturing to the convoy now stretching down his driveway. "You know, this seems like a lot," Theodore said, gesturing to the impressive fleet of vehicles, "but I wanted to show you exactly what we're proposing, not just tell you about it." Jack descended the porch steps slowly, Rusty at his heels. The border collie recognized Theodore immediately, greeting him with enthusiastic tail wagging before darting past to investigate the newcomers. "Where's Ethan?" Jack asked, noticing the boy's absence. "With his grandparents. He wanted to come, hasn't stopped talking about Rusty, but I thought it best to keep this visit focused on business." Theodore extended his hand again. "I hope you don't mind the surprise when you didn't respond to my messages." Jack shook the offered hand, still processing the scene before him. "It's a bit overwhelming." "I know, but so is losing everything you've worked for." Theodore's tone softened. "Let me introduce you to my team, and then we can talk specifics." For the next hour, Jack found himself in a surreal tour of his own property, led by Theodore but with various Nexus specialists, explaining their vision for different areas of the farm. The chief technology officer showed him digital renderings of how the data center would be configured to minimize land disturbance. The sustainability director presented plans for solar arrays that would power both the facility and Jack's remaining agricultural operations. The agricultural consultant outlined how the most fertile sections of the farm could be intensively cultivated using advanced techniques that would maintain productivity while requiring less acreage. As the team's enthusiasm washed over him, Jack felt his resistance weakening. These weren't corporate raiders looking to exploit his land. They were passionate innovators who saw potential where he had seen only devastation. Finally, Theodore guided Jack back to the porch, away from the bustle of the team, now setting up demonstration equipment in the yard. "Why me?" Jack asked, voicing the question that had plagued him since Theodore's departure. "There must be dozens of farms better positioned for your data centers." Theodore leaned against the porch railing, considering his response carefully. "When I asked our research team to identify ideal locations for our rural initiative, they provided data-driven recommendations: fiber optic access, geological stability, elevation above floodplains. But none of those farms had you, Jack." "I'm just a farmer," Jack protested. "No, you're a fourth-generation steward of the land who understands both traditional techniques and the need for innovation. You're someone who risked everything to save strangers without a second thought. Those qualities can't be quantified in a spreadsheet, but they're exactly what we need in a partner." Theodore paused, then added quietly, "And there's something else, something I discovered after returning to San Francisco." He reached into his pocket and withdrew an old photograph, handing it to Jack. "This is from our company archives. Recognize anyone?" Jack studied the faded image. A group of men standing beside what appeared to be early computer equipment, dated 1982. His breath caught as he recognized a familiar face. "That's my father," he said, pointing to a young man in the second row. Theodore nodded. Michael Thornton was one of the first farmers to participate in our agricultural technology pilot program when my father founded the company. His feedback was instrumental in refining the systems that eventually led to Nexus's agricultural division. "Your family has been connected to mine for generations, Jack. We just didn't know it until now." Jack stared at the photograph, a piece of his family history he'd never known. His father had rarely spoken about his involvement with technology companies, focusing instead on teaching Jack the practical aspects of farming. 40 years later, we're standing here discussing a new partnership," Theodore continued. "Some might call it coincidence. I see it as coming full circle." Jack handed the photograph back, his mind racing with implications. "The connection is remarkable, but you're worried about losing your independence," Theodore finished for him, "about compromising the Thornton legacy." Jack nodded, surprised at how accurately Theodore had read his concerns. "That's why our proposal explicitly maintains your ownership and operational control," Theodore explained. "We're not buying your farm, Jack. We're investing in a partnership where both parties bring valuable assets to the table. You bring generations of agricultural knowledge and a perfect testing ground. We bring technology and capital. Together, we create something neither could achieve alone." Jack looked out over his property, now bustling with Nexus personnel. In the fading light, he could almost see the ghosts of his ancestors walking these same fields. His father checking irrigation lines, his grandfather inspecting crops, his great-grandfather turning the first soil. The legacy of Thornton Farm isn't in growing the same crops the same way forever, Theodore said softly, following Jack's gaze. "It's in the continuity of stewardship, in caring for this land so it can support generations to come." As Jack considered these words, Susan's car pulled into the driveway. She emerged, staring wide-eyed at the convoy of vehicles and the activity around the farm. When she spotted Jack on the porch with Theodore, she hurried toward them. "Jack, what's all this?" she asked, confusion and hope mingling in her expression. "Potentially the future," Jack replied, making his decision in that moment. He extended his hand to Theodore. "I'm willing to explore this partnership provided I maintain final say on land usage, and we prioritize sustainable practices." Theodore's smile was genuine as he shook Jack's hand firmly. "Those conditions are already built into our proposal. Thornton Farm will lead the way in showing how traditional family operations can thrive in the modern technological landscape." Susan looked between them, comprehension dawning. "You're saving the farm?" "No," Jack answered, a weight lifting from his shoulders as he spoke. "We're transforming it. The Thorntons have always adapted to survive. This is just the next evolution." As darkness settled over the property, the Nexus team set up powerful lights, illuminating the farmyard. Under their glow, Jack, Theodore and Susan began discussing specifics, the first steps in a partnership that would not only save Thornton Family Farms, but reinvent it for a new era. From his spot on the porch, Rusty watched the proceedings with canine contentment, perhaps sensing what the humans already knew, that sometimes rescue comes in unexpected forms, and the greatest acts of courage aren't dramatic plunges into flood waters, but the willingness to embrace change while honoring tradition. The week after Theodore's surprise visit passed in a whirlwind of activity. Engineers conducted soil tests and measured distances for fiber optic connections. Architects drafted preliminary designs for the data center buildings, working to integrate them naturally into the landscape. Agricultural specialists assessed the portions of land still viable for farming and developed plans for rehabilitation of the flood-damaged soil. Through it all, Jack found himself energized in a way he hadn't felt in years. For so long, his days had been consumed with simply trying to hold on to the land, to solvency, to the Thornton legacy. Now, he was building something new, something with potential beyond mere survival. The partnership agreement was finalized with surprising speed, facilitated by lawyers who managed to translate Jack's handshake with Theodore into 60 pages of legal documentation. As promised, Jack retained full ownership of the land and final approval over all development. The financial terms were even more favorable than the initial proposal, including provisions for profit sharing once the data center became operational. 10 days after the fleet of black SUVs first appeared on his driveway, Jack sat in Alan Peterson's office, signing the documents that would clear his debt with Western Colorado Bank. "I have to admit, Jack, when I suggested reaching out to Blackwood, I never imagined anything like this," Alan said, a note of awe in his voice as he processed the cashier's check from Nexus Technologies. "This isn't just going to save your farm. It's going to transform the whole county's economy." "That's the plan," Jack replied simply, still uncomfortable with the scope of what was happening. The data center would eventually employ over 50 local residents, many in technical positions that paid far more than typical rural jobs. Nexus had also committed to establishing a training program at the community college, creating a pipeline for local talent. "Your father would be proud," Alan said, handing Jack the lien release that officially freed Thornton Farm from debt for the first time in 3 generations. "He always said the Thorntons were survivors." Jack folded the document carefully and placed it in his pocket, thinking of the photograph Theodore had shown him. His father, young and forward-thinking, working with emerging technologies decades before anyone in Mesa County had imagined their potential. He'd be surprised, Jack said finally, but I think you're right, he would be proud. Later that afternoon, Jack stood in what would soon become the heart of the data center, currently just a flat stretch of land marked with surveyors' stakes. Theodore had returned to San Francisco to oversee other aspects of the rural initiative, leaving a capable project manager named Lisa Chen in charge of the Thornton site. Construction begins next week, Lisa said, consulting her tablet as they walked the perimeter. We'll start with the access road and utilities. The main building foundations will follow once the soil compaction tests are complete. Jack nodded, trying to visualize the sleek, low-profile buildings that would rise here. The designs were deliberately understated, single-story structures with living roofs that would blend into the landscape far better than the massive warehouses he had initially feared. "And the timeline for the agricultural restoration?" he asked, his mind still divided between the technological future and the farming present. "The soil remediation team arrives tomorrow," Lisa replied efficiently. "They estimate 6 months to restore optimal growing conditions in the designated agricultural zones, just in time for spring planting. 6 months, half a year to heal land that had sustained Thorntons for a century. It seemed both impossibly quick and agonizingly slow. "Mr. Thornton," Lisa said, her tone softening slightly. "Jack, I know this is a massive change. But what you're doing here, partnering with us rather than selling out, it's creating a model that could help preserve family farms across the country. Mr. Blackwood believes this hybrid approach is the future of rural America." Jack looked across his property, seeing it with new eyes, not as a failing farm, but as a pioneer in a different kind of cultivation. "My great-grandfather came west because he believed in building something that would last," he said quietly. "I think this qualifies." That evening, Jack sat on his porch swing, watching the sunset paint the western sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. Rusty lay at his feet, occasionally lifting his head at the unfamiliar sounds of equipment being unloaded. At the far end of the property, Jack's phone chimed with a text message. It was from Theodore. "How's it going with Lisa and the team? Ethan wants to know when we can visit again. He has a new trick he wants to teach Rusty." Jack smiled despite himself. The boy had clearly made an impression on his dog, and if he was honest, on him as well. "Moving faster than I expected," he typed back. "Your people don't waste time. Tell Ethan he's welcome any time. Rusty misses him." As he pressed send, Jack realized with surprise that he meant it. The Blackwoods, both father and son, had become more than business partners or people he'd rescued. They were becoming friends, connections to a world beyond the boundaries of his farm. The phone chimed again, almost immediately. "He'll be thrilled. By the way, I'm sending something special tomorrow, a replacement for what was lost in the flood." Jack frowned, puzzled, but before he could ask for clarification, the sound of Susan's car coming up the driveway distracted him. She visited, daily now, bringing home-cooked meals and helping Jack sort through the overwhelming amount of information coming from the Nexus teams. "Brought lasagna," she called as she climbed from her car, balancing a casserole dish. "David sends his regards. He's meeting with the Nexus environmental team tomorrow about the solar array placement." They ate on the porch, watching darkness settle over the land as they had done countless times as children. The familiar ritual felt comforting amid so much change. "I ran into Mrs. Lawson at the grocery store," Susan said between bites. "She said they're featuring you in the county paper next week. Local hero brings tech revolution to Mesa County. She wanted to know if you'd do an interview." Jack groaned. The public attention remained his least favorite aspect of the whole situation. "Told her no, I hope." Susan smiled. "I said you were too busy revolutionizing agriculture to pose for photos." "Thank you for that." They ate in companionable silence for a while before Susan spoke again, her voice thoughtful. "You know, Jack, for years I worried about you out here alone, clinging to something that was slowly killing you. I used to imagine having to sell this place after—" She stopped, clearly uncomfortable with completing the thought. "After I worked myself into an early grave like Dad?" Jack finished for her, not unkindly. Susan nodded. "Now I'm thinking about the future for the first time. About Thornton Farm still being here for my kids, maybe even their kids. About it being something more than a museum piece or a cautionary tale." Jack understood exactly what she meant. For too long, he had been the caretaker of something dying. Now he was helping birth something new. The next morning brought Theodore's promised surprise. Jack was checking fence lines when he heard an unusually loud engine approaching. He turned to see a massive semi-truck struggling up his driveway, followed by a Nexus SUV. As the vehicles drew closer, Jack realized what he was seeing: a brand new combine harvester gleaming in the morning sun, being delivered on a flatbed trailer. The machine was top of the line, the kind Jack had seen only in equipment catalogs and dealer showrooms, never imagining he might own one. Lisa Chen emerged from the SUV, holding a clipboard. "Special delivery from Mr. Blackwood," she announced, handing Jack the paperwork. "He said to tell you it's not charity, it's a practical business investment in our agricultural partner. The agreement specifies that 40% of the land remains in active cultivation, and you can't do that without proper equipment." Jack stared at the massive machine, easily worth more than everything else he owned, combined. His first instinct was to refuse it, to insist that he could manage with rental equipment until he saved enough to purchase his own. But something stopped him. Perhaps the memory of his father, stranded in a field with broken-down equipment, or perhaps the realization that pride had nearly cost him everything once before. "Tell Mr. Blackwood thank you," he said finally. "I'll put it to good use." As the delivery team unloaded the combine, Jack's phone buzzed with another text from Theodore. "Consider it making things right. You lost your equipment saving us. This isn't a gift. It's squaring the ledger between partners. Ethan and I will visit next month. He's already packed Rusty's favorite treats." Jack tucked the phone away, a smile tugging at his lips despite himself. Perhaps Theodore understood him better than he'd realized. Understood that what Jack valued wasn't charity, but partnership. Not handouts, but the tools to build something lasting. Rusty barked excitedly, racing circles around the new harvester. As it was lowered to the ground, the sound drew Jack back to the present moment, to this land that had sustained Thorntons for a century and would now, in ways his ancestors could never have imagined, continue to do so for generations to come. The compass his great-grandfather had carried west now sat on Jack's mantelpiece, its needle pointing steadfastly north, just as it had 100 years ago. The direction remained constant, but the journey had changed, evolved into something new yet still fundamentally connected to all that had come before. Jack Thornton walked toward his new harvester, Rusty bounding ahead, both of them stepping surely into a future neither could have imagined just 2 weeks ago, before a flood, before a rescue, before a fleet of black SUVs had arrived to change everything. 6 months later, Thornton Family Farms had transformed almost beyond recognition. The eastern portion of the property now housed the gleaming Nexus Rural Data Center, its low-profile buildings with living roofs blending harmoniously into the landscape. Solar arrays dotted the southern fields, generating more than enough power for both the data facility and the farm operations. And at the heart of it all, the historic farmhouse stood freshly painted and renovated, a symbol of how the old and new could coexist and strengthen each other. Jack stood at the edge of his western fields, surveying the 40 acres now prepared for spring planting. The soil remediation had been remarkably successful. Nexus's agricultural team had employed cutting-edge techniques to restore nutrients and structure to land that had been scoured by floodwaters. The newly installed irrigation system, operating with a fraction of the water his old equipment had required, stood ready to support what promised to be the most efficient growing season in the farm's history. "Ready for the big day tomorrow?" Lisa Chen asked, approaching from the direction of the data center. In the months of working together, she had become not just a colleague, but a friend, someone who bridged the worlds of agriculture and technology in ways Jack was still learning to navigate. "As ready as we'll ever be," Jack replied, turning to face her. "Your team set up the live stream equipment?" Lisa nodded. "All tested and operational. Mr. Blackwood's plane lands at 9 a.m., press briefing at 11, ribbon cutting at noon. We're expecting about 200 attendees, including state officials and media." Jack tried not to grimace. The public aspect of the partnership remained his least favorite part, but he'd gradually come to accept it as necessary. The Thornton Nexus model was drawing national attention as a potential blueprint for revitalizing struggling rural communities across the country. He couldn't hide from that, even if he sometimes wanted to. "Ethan's excited to come back," Lisa added with a smile. "He emails me weekly asking about Rusty." At the mention of the boy's name, Rusty's ears perked up from where he lay nearby. The border collie had somehow intuited that tomorrow would bring a reunion with his young friend, and had been unusually alert all day. "Susan's handling the food for the private reception," Jack said, changing the subject. "Said she wouldn't trust city caterers to know what real country cooking should taste like." They walked together toward the farmhouse, discussing final details for the grand opening celebration. As they approached, Jack could see Susan's car already parked in the driveway. His sister had thrown herself into the farm's transformation with unexpected enthusiasm, leveraging her connections in the community to smooth the integration of Nexus's technology and personnel. Her husband David now consulted regularly with the environmental team, ensuring that the project maintained the highest standards of sustainability. Inside, Susan was arranging freshly cut flowers from her garden on the kitchen table. The farmhouse interior had been thoughtfully updated. Modern appliances and conveniences blended seamlessly with the historic character Jack had been determined to preserve. "There you are," she greeted them. "I was beginning to think you'd forgotten about dinner. David's bringing the dessert when he finishes at the community college." The Nexus Educational Initiative at Riverdale Community College had launched 2 months ago, offering certification programs in data center operations, renewable energy, management, and advanced agricultural techniques. Already 30 local residents were enrolled, preparing for jobs that would allow them to build careers without leaving Mesa County. As they sat down to eat, Jack marveled silently at how much had changed in half a year. The farm that had been on the brink of foreclosure was now financially secure for the foreseeable future. The land that had been devastated by floodwaters was healing and productive again, and he himself had transformed from a solitary figure, fighting a losing battle against economic forces beyond his control, to the central partner in a venture that might help redefine the future of rural America. "Penny for your thoughts," Susan said, noticing his contemplative expression. "Just thinking about great-grandpa William," Jack replied. "Wonder what he'd make of all this." Solar panels and server farms weren't exactly part of his vision when he staked his claim here. "No," Susan agreed, "but I was reading his journal entries from the 1930s again. Remember how he experimented with that new irrigation technique everyone thought was crazy? The county extension agent told him he was wasting his time, but he wrote that a farm that doesn't change is a farm that won't survive. I think he'd understand better than most." Jack nodded. comforted by the connection to his ancestors' pioneering spirit. Perhaps his recent decisions weren't a break with tradition after all, but a continuation of it, adapting to changing conditions while maintaining the core values that had always defined the Thornton approach to stewardship. After dinner, Jack walked alone to the hilltop where 5 generations of Thorntons were buried in the small family cemetery. The setting sun cast long shadows across the gravestones, including the newest, his father's, gone too soon from the stress and physical demands of trying to save a dying way of life. "I think I finally understand, Dad," Jack said quietly to the stone marker. "All those years you spent teaching me that the farm was more than just the crops we grew. It was about finding a way to live in harmony with the land while building something meaningful, something that would last." The next morning dawned clear and perfect, as if nature itself approved of the celebration to come. Jack rose early as always, completing his chores with the efficiency of long practice before showering and reluctantly putting on the new suit Susan had insisted on buying him for the occasion. By 10 o'clock, vehicles were arriving, local officials, media representatives, curious neighbors, and a fleet of black SUVs carrying Nexus executives and their guests. Jack greeted them from the porch, Rusty at his side, his natural reserve gradually giving way to genuine pride as he showed visitors around the property. Theodore Blackwood's helicopter arrived precisely on schedule, landing in the designated area near the solar field. Ethan was the first to emerge, racing toward Jack and Rusty with unrestrained excitement. "Mr. Jack," he called, flinging his arms around Jack's waist. "We came back just like we promised." Rusty danced around them, barking joyfully until Ethan knelt to hug the dog properly. Theodore approached more sedately, though his smile was just as genuine. "Jack," he said warmly, extending his hand, "the place looks incredible, even better than the progress report suggested." "Your team does good work," Jack acknowledged, shaking Theodore's hand. "How was your flight?" "Smooth." Ethan wouldn't stop talking about seeing Rusty again. Theodore glanced around at the gathering crowd. "Quite a turnout." Jack nodded, still uncomfortable with the attention, but determined to get through the day with grace. "Whole county's curious about what we've been building here." They were interrupted by Lisa, clipboard in hand, informing them that the press briefing would begin in 15 minutes. Jack excused himself to make final preparations, leaving Theodore and Ethan to tour the data center with the technical team. The briefing and ribbon-cutting ceremony went more smoothly than Jack had dared hope. He managed to say his few prepared remarks without stumbling, focusing on the history of the farm and his vision for its future as a place where agriculture and technology would enhance rather than replace each other. Theodore spoke eloquently about the broader implications of their partnership, how rural America could be revitalized through thoughtful integration of technology while preserving the values and knowledge that made these communities special. When it was over and the formal photographs had been taken, Jack was relieved to retreat to the private reception in the farmhouse. Here, among family, friends, and key partners, he could relax somewhat, letting Susan and David handle much of the hosting duties, while he spoke more personally with those who had made the transformation possible. As the afternoon wore on, Jack found a moment of quiet on the back porch. Theodore joined him there, 2 glasses of Susan's homemade lemonade in hand. "Quite a journey from that flood rescue," Theodore observed, handing Jack a glass. "If someone had told me then that we'd be standing here today, celebrating this partnership, I'm not sure I would have believed them." Jack nodded, looking out over the property that had been his family's legacy for a century and would now continue as something both familiar and new. Life has a way of taking unexpected turns. "Ethan wants to stay for the summer," Theodore said after a comfortable silence. "If that's okay with you, he's fallen in love with this place. I thought perhaps he could help with the simple farm chores, learn about where food actually comes from, Most city kids never get that opportunity. Jack considered the request, finding that he welcomed the idea of passing on the knowledge his father and grandfather had shared with him. He'd be welcome, could stay in the old bunkhouse. We just finished renovating it for the interns coming in June. Theodore smiled. He'll be thrilled, and it would give me a good excuse to visit more often. He hesitated, then added, "This partnership has become more than just a business venture for me, Jack. I hope you know that." Jack did know. Despite his initial resistance and suspicion, he had found in Theodore not just a business partner, but a friend who understood in his own way the importance of legacy and the challenges of carrying it forward. The Thornton Blackwood Rural Innovation Model, Jack said, gesturing toward the information packets that had been distributed to visitors, has a certain ring to it. It does, Theodore agreed, though I notice you insisted your name come first. Jack allowed himself a rare grin. It is still Thornton Family Farms after all. As evening approached and the guests gradually departed, Jack found himself alone again on the hilltop cemetery, this time accompanied by Ethan, who had asked with solemn curiosity about the gravestones. "So your great-great-grandfather started this whole farm?" the boy asked, sitting cross-legged beside Jack on the grass. "He did. Came west with not much more than a compass and a dream. Built something that's lasted through good times and bad." Ethan considered this, his young face, thoughtful beyond his years. "And now you're changing it, but also keeping it. Dad says that's the hardest kind of thing to do, to honor the past while building the future." Jack glanced at the boy, surprised by his insight. "Your dad's a smart man." "He says you're the smart one, that you found a way to save your family's farm while helping us create something important too." From below they heard Theodore calling Ethan's name, announcing it was time to return to their hotel in town. "Coming, Dad," Ethan called back, then turned to Jack. "I'll see you tomorrow, Mr. Jack, and all summer too." As the boy ran down the hill toward his father, Jack remained seated beside his ancestors' graves. The first stars were appearing. In the darkening sky, the same stars that had guided William Thornton west a century ago, that had watched over every generation since. "We're still here," Jack said softly to those who had gone before. "Different but still here, still Thorntons." In the distance, the lights of the data center glowed softly, while closer at hand, the farmhouse windows shone with a warm welcome. Between them stretched the fields, some now dedicated to technology, others still nurturing the crops that had sustained this family for generations. Not an ending, Jack realized, but a continuation. A new chapter in a story that had been unfolding on this land for 100 years and would now continue in ways his ancestors could never have imagined, but might, he hoped, understand and approve. The simple farmer, who had once faced losing everything, had found something unexpected in the floodwaters that day. Not just a child to rescue, but a future to build, a legacy to renew, and a path forward that honored all that had come before, while embracing all that might come after. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.